first saw Simon speak at a conference here in Hobart several years ago now, and it was subsequent to that I looked at his biography, and one of the quotes from Carol Schwartz was that I don't know one CEO or chairman in corporate Australia who has not worked with Simon Longstaff. He influences conversations in boardrooms, in academia, in the street. He did a PhD in philosophy in Cambridge. He's named as one of AFR Boss True Leaders for the 21st Century. His presentation to the conference is Leading from the Heart, and I thank you for being with us today, Simon. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Again, I'd like to thank the organisers very much for the opportunity to join you here today. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you about the topic of leadership. I think one which has taken on considerable significance in Australia as a whole. Some of the concepts I'm going to be talking about today will echo those you've already heard, including a slight variation on positive deviance that Lee was speaking about. It's always dangerous, though, having a philosopher following a psychologist. There'll be a few terminological differences we might have in terms of what we're talking about, in terms of how we define things as what is an ethical organisation or not, but we'll get to that because it will fit into the point. What I want to do, though, before I start getting into the detail of the views I want to present, I want to ask you to imagine a scene. You're in a medieval European forest and you're proceeding through there, the sunlight's just cutting through small places where you can see glimpses of fields ahead. And when you eventually emerge from this forest, you see a clearing, and in the clearing there's one dominant structure. It's a massive medieval monastery. Now imagine you've got a camera and you're zooming in closer and closer, and you come right up to this room, you pass through a window into a scriptorium, and there you see a line of monks sitting at these beveled desks producing beautiful illuminated manuscripts. And the camera comes closer still, and there's one young man with his tonsured head just poised, about to write, when his hand stops in midair. He freezes. The abbot, who happens to be visiting the scriptorium at the time, comes up to him and says, "My son, what seems to be the problem?" He said, "I've just had a terrible thought, Father Abbot. What if I make a mistake? What if my brother abbots replicate this error throughout history? What consequence would come from that? I cannot go on." The abbot comforts him and says, "Well, look, my son, if you do not trust at least in the quality of control that your brother monks bring to this exercise, at least trust in God. All will be well." And reassured, the young monk goes back to work and continues to produce the work he's been assigned to. Well, later that night, they come to the chapel where they gather regularly for prayer, and the monks are astonished to find that the abbot of the day is missing. This has never happened before, and so a search commences, begins up in the eaves of the monastery, and level by level by level they go down, lower and lower, trying to find the missing abbot. Until eventually, when they're right down in the deepest part of the monastery, they come to a vault where the oldest material that the monastery happens to hold is stored, old scrolls and ancient texts. And it's only then when they open these big doors that they find the abbot right down the very end, sitting alone in a small pool of light, sobbing. They work up and eventually they come to him and they say, "Father Abbot, what is the problem?" He points down to an ancient manuscript and he says, "It says, celebrate." Now, you might wonder, what has this got to do with philosophy or ethics or leadership? Well, it actually has a lot to do with it. The first thing to understand is that in the history of Western philosophy, which I know most about, I know a little bit about the East, but not nearly as much as I do about the West, there's been this mistaken view that it is only just about the head, that somehow or other the appeal to the importance of reason has been at the exclusion of all of the other considerations. And as Lee was suggesting, this is a very unhealthy situation, but it was also never the case. As I'll mention a bit again towards the end, if you go back even to the works of Plato, he was always conscious of the fact that there were a number of horses drawing the chariot of life forward. There was emotion, the affective, there was the will, the conative, and of course there was the cognitive reason. And that all three of these things had to be acknowledged in relation to what made for a good life, although reason ultimately needed to prevail. But it wasn't supposed to be this constant tension that was displayed in the image we saw before. It was a much more integrated notion in which the heart and the head and the spirit were brought together. Now, this notion of trying to integrate these things becomes critical to a way of understanding the role of leadership. I'm going to give you a definition of leadership now that some of you may have heard of in other places, but which I think might surprise you, not because of what it says, but because of its provenance and purpose. And this definition runs as follows. It says that leadership is the exercise of influence in order to bring about the willing consent of others in the ethical pursuit of objectives. So the exercise of influence in order to bring about the willing consent of others in the ethical pursuit of objectives. I don't know if any of you can recognise where that comes from, and it may surprise you to learn that that is in fact the doctrine of the Australian Defence Force. It's how it defines leadership. When people hear this for the first time, they're often surprised. They say, well, it's not about obedience, it's not about orders, it's not about following critical plans. It's got all of these human factors in it, of which I think for many people, the most surprising is this last part, the ethical pursuit. Now they say of missions, but of objectives, of goals. Now the reason why I think it's particularly important is because this was the first definition of leadership that I'd ever seen that treated leadership itself as an ethical practice, not as something into which ethics happen to be bolted. Because for most of the time, at least in the time I've been working in this area, that's what people used to do. They'd say, we'd have a leadership program, can we just add a bit of ethics into it? We just need to sort of inject some in there to complement what is already otherwise in place. Whereas for the Defence Force, they said, no, it's much more than that. The practice of leading is itself an ethical practice. Now, I need to explain why they've thought about this and what it means to have this particular view. The reason why they've adopted this is because of a particular problem that they have to face. And I should declare here, part of the work that we do every year is to prepare Australian Defence Force personnel for being deployed to places like Iraq and Afghanistan. So just before they go, we are brought in to help, if you like, thicken the ethical skin. And it's not just working with the officers, it's also working with all ranks from the different services who are deployed. And the reason why we're doing that is because it's part of Australia's preparation of these people to understand that there are particular challenges that arise in conditions of asymmetric warfare. Now you might think it's a bit odd. Some of you sitting here might be thinking, why is he talking about warfare? Others probably think it's a perfect analogy for primary schools. But in that situation, where you go over and you have to confront people like Daesh, there is no way that in a direct contest of arms, their side would ever prevail. Australian troops, because of the way they're armed and trained and a whole range of other things, are always going to prevail if there's a direct contest of arms, as will other countries like the United States and others involved in this contest. Where our vulnerability lies as nations, as liberal democracies, is at the risk that we can face of losing our moral authority in any engagement. The reason why there are atrocities committed against us and against local civilian populations is because the other side want to draw us into a conflict, and they've been successful in that. And they want us, if possible, to engage in the use of force in a disproportionate or indiscriminate manner, because if they can do that, if Australia is involved in killing civilians who would otherwise should have been protected, then the outrage at home, a justifiable outrage, will lead to our withdrawal and they will have secured their victory. So the purpose of all of what you see, this terrible and apparently chaotic violence, is perfectly rationally conceived in the same way that Hamas thinks about firing indiscriminately rockets into Israel, is determined for the same reason to draw them in. Now, the thing about this situation which they're trying to deal with is what they call a strategic corporal. It's a person who has no significance in terms of the overall hierarchy of an organisation, but who has the capacity actually to cause strategic effects, for good or for ill. In the old days, it used to be that people like Wellington on one horse and Napoleon on another would sit on a hill and they'd direct affairs and they would generate the strategic effects. Down on the ground, the corporal might be engaging in individually heroic conduct or cowardly conduct or whatever. It didn't affect the strategic situation. Today, if a corporal burns a Quran and it's loaded up onto the internet, or some other atrocity occurs, such as it happened in Abu Ghraib, instantly when this begins to spread, there are strategic effects which are being generated, not just where it happened, but in the offices of presidents and prime ministers and all the rest. Now, we all know this is true now, not just for them, but for everybody. We know now that a person working in a call centre in a corporation, or a person who might be a first-year teacher in a school, or somebody who's come into a school from the outside parent body or some other group, if they do something which is inconsistent with what are the proper standards, they can cause a firestorm of controversy in an instant. We've just seen this recently in New South Wales primary schools around certain teaching materials that have been brought in by groups that have been offering prayer groups and various classes of one kind or another. And before you know, and the Gaby Baby film, suddenly it's the premiers involved, the Minister for Education, suddenly it's all over the media in a way that is no longer confined to local issues. So the Defence Force have conceived of this notion of leadership as an ethical practice as a response to that phenomenon. It's a response to what you need to be able to do in the quality of your leadership, not seen as something which is simply delivered by those who've got high office or status, whether it's principals or others, but leadership is a practice that everybody is invited to engage in. And that if you think of leadership in these ethical terms, then you will be able to manage these particular risks. Because what they do know is that you cannot manage this by rules alone. That compliance systems are not the answer. And the military, and I'll leave them behind in a second, they may spend a huge amount of time working on plans and having networks for communication and oversight. They'll have standard operating procedures, they'll have rules of engagement. They have all of that bureaucracy that we saw at Monsters Inc. But they know from hard experience that this does not solve this problem. It only does 15% of the work they need to have done because 85% of the work comes from the quality of the leadership and the culture that that produces. So here's this group of people managing in an extraordinarily difficult situations, understanding that the activities of a single person, wherever they happen to be in the distributed network of leadership, can generate these very profound effects. And they've reckoned that the way to deal with this is through culture, through the internalisation of certain values and principles, and through the exercise of leadership as itself an ethical practice. And one of the reasons that they've come to this point is because one of the hardest things for people to do is actually to see things as they are. The great problem that we have often is to suffer from three types of blindness, call them the three blind mice, that make it impossible sometimes to see what we ought to do, or at least if we see what we ought to do it. Now, the first of these three blind mice is something which I've been suffering from in the past, which is willful blindness. It's the idea that you actually know that you shouldn't do it, but you do it anyway. I'm extremely adept, I have to tell you, at rationalising all sorts of bases for why I should do things I know I shouldn't do. And then I'll find myself doing it. And this happens everywhere. I'm sure I'm not alone in doing this. And you can see that the consequences of this kind of process can be extremely dire. When people deliberately do things they know to be wrong, then we see this in evidence in crime and disruption and other things. Turns out, though, that that kind of blindness is not the most significant. It's actually a minority of cases which are caused by this. The second type, which is more significant, is conditioned blindness. This is where you come to see the world in a way so that you don't actually perceive all of its elements, even those which are of critical importance to you. Now, the little physical analogy of this that I encountered was at Taronga Zoo in Sydney in the old days, where at the tiger enclosure there was a big glass screen over most of it, and there was one section where they had this perspex screen over. And if you stood here in front of the perspex, you didn't see the rest of the world through colour. It basically, I don't know how it did it, but it sort of got rid of it, or probably some kind of an effect that they'd had, a bit like polarisation. But you saw in black and white, basically, which is the way that most animals see. I mean, we're extremely rare. On this planet, I think humans and maybe a couple of birds can see in colour. The rest of the world of animals see it in other frequencies, but not in the visible spectrum we observe. And so when a tiger was walking along in this cage, you'd see it there with its brightly outlined orange stripes, and there it would be, there it would be, there it would be, and then it would disappear. All you'd see is a slight flicker of movement. And it just showed that if you can't see orange in this particular world, how brilliantly camouflaged a tiger happens to be. So if you're sitting there, if you're a sambar deer or something like that, thinking yourself safe because you can't see a tiger, it doesn't mean it isn't there. Your ignorance of it doesn't tame it, it simply finds an easy lunch. Now, there's a certain amount of conditioned blindness that we're all subject to by our education, by our experience, our training. We have ways of coming to see the world which makes us the equivalent of being extremely adept at seeing every shade of green in the jungle, but not orange. And I particularly see this in the corporate world. And I must say that quotation from Carol Schwartz is a tremendous piece of hyperbole. There are plenty of chairmen and CEOs I haven't worked with. But those I have worked with, you'll see these people, usually my age or slightly older, usually men, sitting around a board table, and somebody will say to them, look, Lee, you may have actually encountered this when you're doing your corporate work. You'll point out to them some aspect of their environment which is either a wonderful opportunity or a terrible risk, and because it falls outside their area of expertise, they might have been a lawyer or an accountant or somebody in commerce, because they can't see this through their own particular conceptual framework, they will dismiss it. It's not worth looking at. They are sometimes like toddlers who come up to you. You know, there's very small children at that moment in their life where they come up to you and they put their hands over their face and they say to you, you can't see me. Well, grown men do this all the time. To the tiger, they go up like this, you can't see me, and then wonder why they're eaten for lunch. So conditioned blindness is a particular problem. And there are antidotes for these, I should say. And the third mouse is vicious blindness. Now, this gets a little bit into the notion of the work of Aristotle, and I'm very pleased that Lee referred to the notion of virtue in this. The key concept in Aristotle's work, well, I'll claim it's the key, there are probably disputes about this, but one of the key concepts is this faculty which he calls phronesis, or to translate it, practical wisdom. And some of you have probably studied this. The person who possesses practical wisdom is the phronimos. And the aim is to become virtuous so that you become the phronimos. And the key aspect about practical wisdom is how it allows you to see the world as it actually is. Now, if Aristotle was here today or tonight and he wanted to conduct an experiment, he'd probably come to the dinner and he'd have a metre-long ruler with him and he'd get all of you to line up and he'd get you without notice to grasp the metre as he drops it, one of those reaction tests. And he'd do it 3 times for each of you and he'd reach an average. Now, the first thing Aristotle would say is there's going to be a relative difference between each of you, depending on your age, your state of health, all of those factors. But whatever he's going to measure as the average of those 3 drops will be objectively true of you relative to others in that moment. Now, phase 2 of Aristotle's experiment gets a little bit more interesting, because what he then does is he takes you all to the bar and he lines up a series of shot glasses which contain identical quantities and quality of alcohol. He says, now your task now is to drink as many of these shot glasses as you think you need to drink in order to reduce your reaction speed by half. And then I'm going to come back and measure it. And what Aristotle claims is that if you are a virtuous person, you'll pretty much get it right, but that if you suffer from the vice of gluttony, then you will constantly overestimate this. Now, I can tell you this is true in relation to things like chocolate. In my own case, it's probably true in relation to alcohol. But the thing about vice in the Aristotelian worldview is that it stops you seeing things as they actually are. And so the aim is to try and develop a virtuous character so that you can correctly perceive the world as it is without these distorting effects, a little bit like the distortions caused by the screen here in conditioned blindness. Now, all three types of blindness actually have their antidotes in a form of ethics. Aristotle's particular response to it is to say that what you aim to do in virtue is to find what he calls the golden mean. So if I just take one of the things that was up on the screen here, the virtue of courage, he makes it very clear that there is no virtue in the conduct of a reckless individual who just throws themselves into harm's way, indifferent to its effects. And he says there is no virtue in the person who cowardly hides behind in the face of some danger when everybody else is exposed to it. The courageous person correctly perceives the situation, understands and appreciates the risks and dangers, but when required to do so, will act. And it's about the development of those dispositions, all on the golden mean, which is the critical part of what Aristotle argues that you do, through the practice and conduct of certain habitual ways of life, but eventually making them your own. And again, we'll come to what that means in a moment. So, the virtuous life, the reflective life, is the antidote to the situation of the three blind mice, which either prevent us from doing what is right and securing the benefits from that, or continue to lead us into positions where we might do wrong or suffer the consequences. And it becomes a challenge for all of us as to how to have a form of leadership which extends across the full network of leadership in a school so that everybody is attuned to this capacity. Now, there are two things that prevent this from happening and which have a particular solution in the form of leadership, a particular form of leadership to solve them. I'm going to illustrate these two things by two true stories. The first of them involves a former Prime Minister of Australia, Gough Whitlam, who was invited while Prime Minister to give a speech in London on Australia's economic policy. And on this occasion, his host was the Lord Mayor of London, and the event was being held in the Mansion House in the city. So it's this wonderful place where all the good and the great from the City of London, the financiers, the bankers, were going to come together to hear Whitlam speak. The Lord Mayor of the day was an arch-conservative, and Whitlam believed that he had absolutely nothing in common with this man because he thought of himself, of course, as he was as a radical reforming Prime Minister. So what was he going to say, he thought, just before he got underway to give this rather dry text about economic situations? Well, he noticed on a briefing sheet provided by a protocol officer that there was one salient fact, and that was that the Lord Mayor had been a distinguished oarsman who had rowed for his school, rowed for his university, he'd gone on and he'd rowed for Great Britain. So Whitlam stands up and he says, Your Worship, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, I came here this evening thinking that His Worship and I have absolutely nothing in common. But now I see that we are united by one thing. And the thing that unites us is that, as you know, he is a distinguished oarsman and I am a politician. And the thing that unites us is that we look one way and go the other. Now, it's been a rather sad story to tell in recent years in politics, because there has been so much of looking one way and going the other, making a promise and breaking it. But as we all know, the moment we hear it, this is a story about hypocrisy. And the first and the greatest enemy of ethics is that. We know from the time we're small children what it means, what it feels like, what it actually feels like to have somebody whom we respect and admire in a position of authority to say one thing and then to do something else. It's terrible. It not only makes you sceptical, it makes you cynical. And cynicism is like an acid that eats away at the bonds of any community. And it has a terrible effect on organisations. And the thing that people don't often realise, and this is why the question about Monster Inc. and its bureaucracy is so important, you might be a person who is individually committed to a certain framework of values and principles. You might live it personally, you might speak it personally, you might enact it every day, yet you may preside over a system of policies, of procedures, of structures, which are all sending a different message. And you will be tagged with responsibility for that. No matter how virtuous an individual you think you are, if you are responsible for a system which seems to contradict the things you claim to be true, you will be perceived as a hypocrite, even though that may seem to be unfair, even though you may not have direct control over those things. Just to give you an example from another world, in financial services, we all know they talk all the time about the need to match a good product to the right needs of the person. And yet you can go into these organisations and you can ask them, how do they measure and reward performance? On volume of sales. Nothing else. When you ask them why they do it, that's the way the industry operates. The message it sends to people in those organisations is, yeah, we say all this stuff about proper alignment. What we actually want you to do is something else. And that's the source of the perception of hypocrisy. And if people start to say, well, if they don't believe it, why should I? It opens up a gap, and they don't leave it open for long. They begin to fill it with other values, with other principles, sometimes with self-serving ones, some things which start to degrade the opportunity to build a really resilient organisation. Now, this experience of hypocrisy, which we see in all manner of institutions, is not the product of people waking up in the morning and saying, look, how much of this can I do before lunch today? You know, my task today is to engage in as much hypocrisy as I can so that when I go to bed tonight, I want to have lots of cynicism, coursing through the veins of my organisation. No, they don't do that. What happens is an altogether more simple but profound phenomenon, and it's the second great enemy of ethics. I learned about it in its most critical form in a taxi cab in Sydney heading to an airport on my way to Brisbane. I was sitting next to a taxi driver who was telling me his life story, as they sometimes do, and he was describing how he had only recently come to be driving taxis. Before then, he'd been a concrete truck driver, which explained a few things with his driving. But the more important thing was that we were having a royal commission into allegations of corruption in the New South Wales building industry at this time. And so I asked this man who'd actually been in the industry, I said, can you tell me, is it true? He goes, mate, he says, mate. No, he said, you're building a hospital for the nuns out at St Mary's, and one of the bosses or one of his mates wants to have an extension to his house or a swimming pool put in. So, mate, before you know it, we divert the truckloads of concrete, and after a while, there's the extension, there's the swimming pool. I said, wow, that's pretty bad. He said, oh, no, mate. He said, mate, something worse than that was happening. Had to get out. And I'm thinking to myself, what's worse than stealing from nuns? That's very serious thing. I'm imagining whole buildings being relocated in the dead of night. No, mate, he said, mate, somebody stole $20 from the lockers in the workshop where I used to get changed, and I wasn't going to have a bar of that. So out he goes and starts driving cabs. I'm left wondering a bit about his sense of relativity, but anyway, we drive along a bit further. He says, mate, what do you do? And I said, I run an ethics centre. He said, well, what's that? And I began to explain to him, and as I talked to him about it, he got really, really excited. I will still see him when I die. I'll see the image of this man smiling at me with this big smile, tapping on the back of this hand like going, mate, that's what we need, mate, an ethics centre, mate, an ethics centre. Now imagining that the nuns were going to be safe and no one was going to steal money from the lockers in the workshop. And I'm feeling really good about this. I'm thinking, I'm back in Australia. I just come back from overseas. Here I am talking about it with a cab driver. It's absolutely the way to go. We get to the airport. I ask for a receipt for my taxi fare. He says, yeah, mate, now how much do you want it for? And I probably should have packed up then and given up. But the point of it was that I wasn't going to die wondering about this. So I asked this guy, I said, look, don't you think that after 10 minutes or so of talking about ethics, this is a really strange thing to do, to ask me if I would like to rip off an ethics centre? And he got the point of the question, but he didn't get angry. He just looked slightly, well, maybe confused. What was it? Blank or confused, maybe. And he just turned to me and he said, mate, he said, everybody does it. That's just the way we do things around here, mate. And that was the golden moment, because that is the second, perhaps the greatest enemy of ethics. If you think for yourself a bit about your own organisations, imagine if I was to walk in and ask why things are done. Would people say, oh, we do it because it's to do with our purpose, and these are the values and the principles that shape the way we operate? Or would I hear people saying, well, that's just what we do, that's the way you do things. Everybody does it like this. I've been into lots of places where that's where the response is. It's not that they're doing bad things, it's just that they're not in any way attaching the conduct in which they engage day to day with an answer to the core question of ethics, which is, what ought one to do? That's the first thing you've got to ask. What ought one to do? Why this thing? Why this choice? Why this practice? And it brings me to the antidote. Now, it is about leadership, but it's about a particular model of leadership which I think absolutely echoes Lee's notion of positive deviance. I want to introduce another word in, which is similarly a little challenging. You see, I think that leadership is about constructive subversion. It's a variation on the theme. People in management roles, they play an absolutely vital task. Imagine there's a cork in a stream and it's going along with the flow, and they're pulling the levers and pushing the buttons and making sure it all stays steady and no one falls off. But they go where it's taken by the stream. Leaders never just go where the stream's taking them. What they subvert is unthinking custom and practice. They never let something be done just because everybody does it this way or because it's the way it's always been done. But they act constructively in their subversion, a bit like positive deviation, because they don't seek to impose their own idiosyncratic view on an organisation, nor do they seek to destroy it. Their task is to help it become more like the thing it says it wants to be. But it takes one of the greatest of virtues to do this, which is not physical courage, but moral courage. Because almost no one wants you to do it. There'll be people in your schools who just want you to leave it alone, let them get on with their job, let them do what they know how to do, let them give effect to well-defined experience and technique. There'll be peers who'll say, can you just shut up? You're making us all look a bit bad. You ask these questions. Why do you do that? There'll be superiors who'll tell you that it's above your pay grade. Not your job to ask. Your role is something else. Now, being ethical, if you think about this, and moral courage, if you think about that spectrum I talked about before of the golden mean, it's not about being the reckless individual who just throws themselves onto the funeral pyre of integrity whenever they get a chance, you know. Up they go, a few brief but beautiful sparks, and then they're gone. It's not that. It's not about being a little rabbit on the roadway of life that people pat and say, isn't it nice? They're ethical. Pat, 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 pat. Big truck called reality bearing down and they're destined to be roadkill. It's not about that. It's not about hiding away, being unprepared ever to take a risk about those matters that truly matter around the purpose and values and principles for your school, in your situation, for your profession. It's about being nimble, it's about being agile, it's about being engaged in a world which is not fixed in its opportunities, but which presents to you, for your observation, various inflection points, things that you can change to make different. I'll give you an example of this from a different world, the world of construction, of the taxi driver. A man came to see me, over 20 years ago. He'd been working for 30 years at that time, building houses, warehouses, whatever they were. He'd always stuck to his word. He'd always finished on time and on budget. He had a great reputation for integrity at a time when his competitors were actually undercutting him, making fanciful projections in terms of cost and time. Here he was, at risk of going out of business because he wouldn't play their dirty game. And he came to us and he said, look, I've got this dilemma, and this is the truth about the human condition. We've not yet found a religion or a philosopher or anyone that can eliminate a radical degree of uncertainty when it comes to the ethical dimension. Because on the one hand, he had a commitment to his integrity. On the other hand, he had a commitment to the people who needed to preserve their jobs. And how is he going to balance those things? Because so often in life, it's not a choice between good and bad, right or wrong. It's good versus good. It's right versus right. To take a domestic example, you believe in truth on the one hand and you believe in compassion on the other. Someone you love buys a new hat, haircut, cloak, dress. How do I look? They ask. And you're thinking, oh. No. And you know if you tell them the truth, you will hurt them. It's not as if you abandon truth-telling. It's not as if you abandon compassion. This is the truth of the human condition, that we are required, particularly in leadership positions, to make decisions when in principle there may be no right answer, that no one can see. Some people flee from this into the arms of fundamentalists, people who say, oh, yes, we know it's complicated, but you don't have to think for yourself. Just do what we tell you and you'll be fine. Thanks, some people say. Other people flee towards the hedonistic response. Let's all get pissed. Let's drink a lot of Aristotle's alcohol. Maybe someone else will sort it out when we sober up. Both extremes deny the obligations that humans have to stick with the uncertainty. I like that one better too. To stick with the uncertainty. You see, contrary to what Lee said, an ethical organisation, Lee, in my view, is not about one that merely does no harm. I think that's not what ethics is about. Ethics is about, it's the reflective practitioner. A moral organisation may simply, as a matter of habit, do things which are good according to those things. The thing that distinguishes ethics, at least in the philosophical tradition, is its commitment to the examined life. It's a commitment that even though we can't be certain, we'll do our best, we'll be sincere, we'll make our attempt to act with moral courage when the moment is right and continue to do so even in conditions of radical uncertainty. We won't be seduced by the siren call of the fundamentalists or the hedonists. We'll just stay in that imperfect, difficult human moment. And particularly for you as leaders, that's where it's difficult, because I know that in your schools, when you think about this antidote to those enemies of ethics, you want the equivalence, if you like, of all of your strategic corporals, all of your teachers, all of your admin staff, everybody, the parents, to embody the purpose, the values and the principles of your school. I know that you want them to be part of this and that they won't engage with ethics just as an academic exercise where you teach, like you might teach about mathematics, that certain propositions count as axioms, that there are certain procedures you could follow. It's not a form of knowledge which is enough to know about. Some people study ethics as part of philosophy in uni, and they can tell you all about the great thinkers and what they said, but I know that you not merely want people to know the that about it or the how of it, but you want them actually to embody the dispositions, to actually care about this, to give practical effect to this in the way in which they make decisions and conduct their affairs as teachers within your schools. And that puts a particular burden back on you. So the heart of ethics is in reflective practice. It's in a kind of moral courage that's attentive to the circumstances in which it finds itself. It's the solution that you find in relation to the builder, because I told you about his dilemma between integrity on the one hand and survival on the other. What happened in that situation, to talk about these inflection points and why you don't have to be the rabbit? We said to this man, well, you've been there for 30 years now and you've been able accurately to estimate cost and time. Are you prepared to put your money where your mouth is? He said, yeah. Well, what would that look like? Well, what it would look like is that you might go to a client and offer them 10% of the contract price as a bond that you're willing to forfeit if you overrun on cost or time. Why would I do that, he said. Because all you need to do is to ask your clients to require the same of your competitors. And the instant they do, they tilt the table. Because the unscrupulous competitor will no longer have an advantage. This is what ethics is about. It's about being creative. It's about being engaged. It's about finding these inflection points. And it's about recognising that although reason has its role, it's the feeling, the empathetic response to people and the possibility of what it means to encounter that hypocrisy I spoke of before, and the capacity to have the moral courage to act in cases where constructive subversion is perfectly required. In fact, may even be an obligation. On that note, I'll end. Thanks very much.